Hello and welcome to this week's episode of DIY History. I'm Cassidy Cash, and this is the place to learn about the history of William Shakespeare and how you can participate in a few pieces of that history for yourself. If you like history, Shakespeare, and DIY crafts, then this is the channel for you. Hit that like and subscribe button because we're here every Saturday. Queen Elizabeth I is supposed to have played at bowls, and there's one story of how on July 19th of 1588, English Vice Admiral Sir Francis Drake allegedly was playing at bowls at Plymouth Hoe when the arrival of the Spanish Armada was announced. And his reply was, "We have time enough to finish the game and beat the Spaniards too." Now, most historians today consider this story to be apocryphal, but it does show how important the game of bowling was for Elizabethan nobles. Today on DIY History, I'm going to show you how you can play at bowls the way that was popular during Shakespeare's lifetime. For Tudor and early modern England, a bowling green like this one was a popular part of a proper estate plan. Now, that would be a huge estate for noble families, but it was considered something that you wanted to have as part of your grounds. Now, the Tudor and early modern period is included in part of Shakespeare's lifetime and then just before Shakespeare, if you're using William Shakespeare to mark your centuries. Now, Tudor bowling greens were a standard part of noble estates, and they were large open green spaces with areas large enough to play at bowls. The game of bowling was very fun, but for Shakespeare's lifetime, it was primarily a means to an end for people looking to curry favor or gain power in political circles. Gambling was considered both a sin as well as a popular pastime for Tudor England. So the game of bowling, which involved gambling, skirted the line between appropriate and inappropriate behavior in terms of reputation. Thomas Dekker wrote about bowls in the book called The Seven Deadly Sins of London from 1606. He writes that Sloth gave orders that dicing houses and bowling alleys should be erected, whereupon a number of poor handy craftsmen that before wrought night and day, they never took care for a good day's work afterwards. So obviously he feels the game of bowling is entirely corrupting his workmen and that they're not getting anything useful done because they're constantly bowling. Hampton Court, Nonsuch Palace, and Whitehall were set up for numerous amounts of elite sports. They had tilt yards, cockpits, and bowling alleys. The complex at Whitehall specifically was so elaborate that it included 4 indoor tennis courts, a jousting yard, a cockfighting pit, and a bear baiting pit, along with, yes, you guessed it, a bowling green. In 1361, bowling was banned altogether in England under King Edward III, who wanted all male citizens to focus on archery because he wanted everybody to be ready for war, and archery was the primary military weapon at the time. Later, Henry VI would reverse that ban in 1455, and his reversal gave rise to all kinds of all-weather bowling spaces in 15th century London, and it was much more of a game for the general public. Now, that changed again under Henry VIII, who felt bowling should be reserved for only the elite. So he passed a law in 1541, and there were some laws he passed in 1511 as well. But he legislated bowling away from the general populace, and they were only allowed to play on Christmas Day. The rest of the year, it was a sport exclusively for the elite. In 1555, Queen Mary took things a step further and outlawed even the Christmas Day games. But it seems in spite of all of these bans, people continued to play bowling despite the rules because there's a lot of records showing that bowling was played at local taverns. There were arranging bowling matches at local halls, and then they're having bowling matches out on the village green. Now, as you might expect, gambling was a regular part of the game in the early modern and Tudor period. And there was one account in 1648 of a man named Sir Edgar Hungerford who lost his entire estate because he was betting on a bowling match. Even the father of the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther, was fond of the game of bowling, and he liked ninepence. He had a bowling lane built next to his home for his children, and he would be known to even roll the ball himself sometimes. As a fun fact, the area of New York known today as Bowling Green was discovered around 1609 when Henry Hudson brought explorers there. And the space is called Bowling Green because the original explorers played bowling there. Now, they specifically played a kind of bowling called ninepins in that section of Lower Manhattan. The Crossrail Project also uncovered different kinds of bowling balls, which their image shows you here. The ball itself is what's called a bowl, and likely for Shakespeare's lifetime, the word bowl and ball would have been pronounced very similarly. There were different kinds. So there were flat bowls that were best for alleys. There were round biased bowls. Now, a biased bowl is where a weight has been added to one side, so it rolls a certain way. This would give you an advantage on like open grounds. And round bowls were selected for playing areas that were flat and level with no obstruction. There were a variety of ways to play at bowls, and all of them were considered bowling. So it all comes under the same heading. It's kind of like cards is a header for a game, and there's all different kinds of card games. Bowling was very similar. There's bowling, and then there's all kinds of different ways to play at bowls. One of the earliest forms of bowling was a game called cones. Now, this is when two small cone-shaped objects were placed on opposite ends, and players would try to roll their bowl as close as possible to the opponent's cone. The game of Cales, which is the one that we call ninepins, it would be called ninepins later, usually involves throwing a stick at 9 pins that you have set up in a square formation. Now, there are some evidence that Cales was sometimes played with a bowl that was rolled at the 9 pins, similar to 10-pin bowling that we have today, where the idea would be to knock down all of the pins in the least number of throws. Other times you'd be taking a stick and throwing it at the 9 pins, trying to knock down the center pin and leave the rest of them. So Cales had 2 different versions, all involving setting up 9 pins from the start. Now, if you're interested in the details of many ways to play the game of bowls that existed in Shakespeare's lifetime, you can visit the show notes for today's episode. I've put a list of sources for all the history I'm sharing with you today, and that includes places you can go way more in depth on the general game of bowling, as well as various ways to play them. If you are an educator or a teacher and you want to take the game of bowls into your classroom, I have put together a Tutor Bowling Guide available in our patrons area inside our digital downloads library. This guide goes over 5 different ways to play bowls and adaptations you can use to play them in a classroom or at home when you don't have maybe official equipment. It includes, how to make the cones from home and alternatives you can use for pens if you don't have official bowling pens. Find the links for all of that below this video. For this episode, I'm going to teach you how to play the 9-pin version of bowling for Shakespeare's lifetime. You start by setting up 9 pins. Now, you can purchase a cheap bowling set at the store for kids and use only 9 of them because a typical bowling set comes with 10 pins. Or you can use 9 of really any object that's easily knocked over. So a tin can or a water bottle would work great here. And I'm talking about an empty water bottle, of course. So raid your recycle bin and recycle them for the purpose of sport. Seems like a great use of them. So once you have your 9 pins set up in a square, you want your player to stand at the corner of them. So you can either, basically the pins need to be set up in a diamond formation as they're oriented to the player. So if the player's looking at the square, it's going to look like a diamond from the perspective of the player. You can either move the pins or move the player to accomplish that orientation, but that's how you want to be set up. Now, from here, there are 2 ways to play. You can either throw an object at the pins and try to knock all of them down with the fewest number of throws. That can be done with a ball or a stick or really anything that you want to throw at them. Or you can play with a king pin. Now, the king pin is a larger pin placed right in the middle of the 9 square. And the object of the game is to knock over the king pin while leaving the other pins standing. In historical record, 9 pins where you're trying to knock down the king pin was typically played with a stick as opposed to a bowl. I think that just makes the precision of getting the center one easier to do. And the way that you would play in competition is if you are able to knock over the king pin on your first throw and you don't knock down any of the other pins, you automatically win. But if you're competing with another player, it's the person who can get to the king pin first with the fewest number of other pin casualties. So that's how you play Ninepin. It's called Chaos in Shakespeare's lifetime. And there's 2 different ways to play. Choose your favorite and have fun practicing this game direct from the life of William Shakespeare. That's it for this week. Thank you for watching. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.